The Guardian.
The Guardian Books Podcast with Richard Lee.
We were all uprooted. The earth was stolen from beneath our feet. We became a diaspora, an unnamed nation of bastards. We channeled our roots to the pulse of light, deep within the galaxies of our mind. Our breath was the sky.
1944 vor der sowjetischen Armee geflohen waren, wurden von den Alliierten displaced persons genannt.
A person who has been forced to leave his or her native place. The phenomenon known as forced migration.
Eine Person, die sich kriegsbedingt außerhalb ihres
The UN says that nearly half of the world's displaced people are children. Thousands of Syrian families have fled to refugee camps to escape the violence in Syria and now find themselves living in tents without
The Yugoslav
even
wars
basic
caused hundreds of thousands of people to flee from violence, many of them westwards. It has been estimated that 50,000 Roma escaped from Kosovo to Germany. Over half of them are children.
When I put into a popular search engine the word global citizen, I got 231 million references.
We need global citizens. People who apply the idea of citizenship to a global level.
Humanity was born on the move, striding on 2 feet across the African savannah. We've been travelling ever since, on foot, on rafts, on horseback. But the rise of global trade and mass air travel in the second half of the 20th century has seen unprecedented numbers of people in transit. Some of them are forced by political or economic necessity. Others are following their dreams or just going on holiday. But how have these moving populations shifted the world of letters? The novelist Michel de Kretser, who won the Miles Franklin Award last week, encapsulates this world in motion. Born in Sri Lanka, she's lived in Australia since childhood, 2 countries which provide the setting for much of her prize-winning novel, Questions of Travel. But her ambition is truly global, as she showed when she came to the studio to talk to Claire Armitstead and read from the novel.
You'll come a-waltzing Matilda with me.
She looked at a bridge, and what she saw wasn't balustrade and arch, but the embodiment of a sonnet. As for the monuments, they were iconic from tea towels. Then came a red-purple tree, magisterial in a park. Laura had never seen another like it, and she recognised it at once. Copper beeches were always turning up in novels. That was what it meant to be Australian. You came to London for the first time and discovered what you already knew. But that was in the first floating, glassy days. Underneath, it was all strange. The trees were large green buildings locked up in squares. And why had they called it Paddington? It was nothing like Paddo in Sydney. That went for Edgware Road, too. It was equally amazing to find Indian shops run by Indians. Unlike at home, where Indians were few, and the same racks of bright, flimsy garments and clumsily carved pantheons were presided over by flower children who had faded on the stem. "Hoxton, isn't that a little off-piste?" exclaimed a rotund voice, and Laura knew herself incurably alien. English in the mouths of the English was a dream language, an affair of illusion and code. She couldn't get used to the washing arrangements. No showers! But doing things differently was the point of leaving home. Willingly she scrubbed the tub before and after. Then her landlady, a sweet-faced Christadelphian called Blanche, asked her not to bathe every day. It uses hot water, you see. It was June. Each blade of grass stood up polished and green. Laura came out of the National Gallery. She told the first friendly face, "I am 25 years old." What she meant was something like, "I've missed 25 years of looking at those pictures." It was a straightforward sentiment, but all she could do, trembling a little, was repeat herself. Passers-by saw one of London's mad, a large girl talking to a lion.
Up rode the troopers, 1, 2, 3, with the jolly jumbuck that you got in your tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.
Michelle, you're Australian, as is Laura. She's one of the two central characters in Questions of Travel.
Yeah.
How much do you think this is a very particularly Australian perspective you have?
I think that, speaking for myself, I have a confused perspective, having grown up in Sri Lanka, or perhaps just a dual perspective. But it's certainly one of an outsider's point of view. And so that is what Laura and I have in common when Laura comes to London. And I think I always have a sense of what it is like to see wherever I am now from the outside. Because even though I have lived in Australia for 40 years, I still don't feel as if I am completely on the inside. Certainly back in Sri Lanka, I am also on the outside. So I think that pervading this novel is that dual vision.
You have two central characters, and the other is Ravi, who is Sri Lankan.
Yes.
And they embody different sorts of travel, different reasons for travel, different destinations.
Well, Ravi is a young man who dreams of travel, dreams of being a tourist, but has not got the means to be one. And his way of compensating for that really is through the internet. And he becomes quite fascinated with virtual travel. But then terrible things happen to Ravi and to people close to him. And he finds himself obliged to flee Sri Lanka, and he goes to Australia to seek asylum. So that becomes the kind of travel that defines Ravi, rather than just tourism. And I have other characters who are immigrants. So I was really wanting to write about different forms of travel. I mean, many people in the world today are travelling for one reason or another, whether for pleasure as tourists, or because they are fleeing famine or persecution or war. You know, really today we are in the situation which is quite unprecedented in history, that the amount of mixing up of people in the world for one reason or another, that level we have no experience of, really. We're making it up as we go along. Empires have always mixed people up, of course, but just the sheer scale that we see today is without precedent. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is technology, because technology is often at the bottom of social change. The invention of the 747 in the late 1960s just made it possible to shift large numbers of people around the globe for a relatively low cost. This is the result.
You make the distinction between the people who arrive seeking asylum in Australia by boat and
Yes.
the ones who arrive by plane.
The government and successive Australian governments have deemed all asylum seekers who arrive by boat to be illegal immigrants. So they are locked up in detention centres. If someone comes in by plane, in other words, they have got a tourist visa, by whatever means, they then have the right to apply for asylum once they are in Australia. Then they are granted a visa which allows them to live and indeed work in Australia until their request for asylum is processed. If they are then accepted, well, that's fine. If not, at that point they have to go back to wherever they came from.
And Ravi has done the right thing, but he still has a terrible time trying to work his way in.
When Ravi tells people that he's a refugee, they say, well, where were you locked up? How long were you in detention for? And then when he says he arrived by plane and he wasn't locked up, they then doubt the authenticity of his claim. They say, well, he can't really be a refugee then, can you?
He doesn't have witness, does he, to where he's been? He doesn't have anyone who is prepared to put their name to the signature to say that he did suffer the horrible things he suffered.
Well, that's right. And this is a very common case with asylum seekers, that people back home are often far too frightened to bear witness because they think that there will be repercussions for them back home. And where they can be persuaded to sign these statements, to bear witness, then in Australia or other Western countries where they're seeking asylum, these documents are often treated with a measure of suspicion. And this is difficult to judge, especially when you're dealing with people who have been deeply traumatized.
You have this wonderful line near the beginning. I think you put it into the mouth of Brother Ignatius, isn't it, who teaches Ravi in Colombo. He says, history is only a byproduct of geography. Geography is destiny, it is old, it is iron.
Where you live determines many things about your life, what will happen to you. For instance, whether or not you find yourself caught up in a civil war. He's not a political activist. He doesn't go out and court danger. He just finds himself subjected to history. Whereas Laura, who is in Australia, for Laura, history is something that happens on television, which is the definition of a lucky country, really. History happens to other people and you view it on screen.
It's a very difficult novel to discuss in some ways because it's got lots of awful things that happen, but they happen in the background. In a way, it's a novel without plot. Things happen to people. They don't even really meet. They hardly meet, Ravi and Laura.
One of the things I wanted to do was to draw the reader through this long book, was to have them wondering what is the connection between these two stories, which are completely independent of each other. When are they going to meet? Where are they going to meet? What is going to be the connection between them? I could not possibly describe 9/11 in any way that would add anything. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by that, I thought I would just turn it to my advantage. So all I have to do is mention a photograph of a man falling from a tower, and everyone knows that it's 9/11. So it's quite handy, I think, in some ways, to be able to evoke those events very quickly, and the reader just fills in all the detail from his or her own image bank and knowledge of what went on.
Waltzing Matilda, waltzing Matilda, you'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.
Underneath the arches, we dream our dreams of bum bum ba da be do.
Everybody,
underneath the bum bum ba
Questions of Travel is published in the UK by Allen and Unwin. The Japanese-American novelist Ruth Ozeki is another writer charting connections which span the globe. Her latest novel, A Tale for the Time Being, is set in motion when a Japanese-American writer living, like Ruth Ozeki, in British Columbia finds a lunchbox washed up on the shore. In it, she sees the diary of a teenage girl, a girl who is struggling herself after being uprooted from California and transplanted to the city of her birth, Tokyo.
She closed the diary and placed it on the desk, but even after putting the book aside, she was aware of an odd lingering sense of urgency to... what? To help the girl? To save her? Ridiculous. Her first impulse when she'd started the diary was to read quickly to the end, but the girl's handwriting was often hard to decipher, and her sentences were peppered with slang and intriguing colloquialisms. It had been years since Ruth had lived in Japan, and while she still had a reasonable command of the spoken language, her vocabulary was out of date. In university, Ruth had studied the Japanese classics, The Tale of Genji, No drama, The Pillow Book, literature going back hundreds, even thousands of years, but she was only vaguely familiar with Japanese pop culture. Sometimes the girl made an effort to explain, but often she didn't bother, so Ruth found herself logging onto the internet to investigate and verify the girl's references. And before long, she had dragged out her old kanji dictionary and was translating and annotating and scribbling notes about akiba and maid cafes, otaku and hentai. And then there was the anarchist, feminist, Zen Buddhist, novelist nun? She leaned forward and did an Amazon search for Jiko Yasutani, but, as Nao had warned, found nothing. She Googled Nao Yasutani and again came up with nothing. She had better luck with Dogen, whose masterwork, Shobo Genzo, or The Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, did have an Amazon ranking, albeit nowhere near Proust's. Of course, he'd lived in the early 13th century, so he was older than Proust by almost 700 years. When she searched for time being, she learned that the phrase was used in the English title of Chapter 11 of the Shobo Genzo, and she was able to locate several translations along with commentaries online. The ancient Zen master had a nuanced and complex notion of time that she found poetic and somewhat opaque. Time itself is being, he wrote, and all being is time. In essence, everything in the entire universe is intimately linked with each other as moments in time, continuous and separate. Ruth took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. She took a sip of tea, her head so full of questions she barely noticed the tea had long grown cold. Who was this Nao Yasutani, and where was she now? While the girl hadn't come right out and said she was going to commit suicide, she'd certainly implied as much. Was she sitting on the edge of a mattress somewhere, fingering a bottle of pills and a tall glass of water? Or had that hentai gotten to her first? Or perhaps she had decided not to kill herself, only to fall victim to the earthquake and tsunami instead, although that didn't make a lot of sense. The tsunami was in Tohoku, in northern Japan. Nao was writing in a maid cafe in Tokyo. What was she doing at that maid cafe in the first place? Fifi's? It sounded like a brothel.
So what's the book about then?
Oh, gosh, I have as much trouble summarizing this as you would. I think this novel is about everything that's floated through my head in the last decade. I mean, that goes back to 9/11. It includes the Gulf Wars, research that I was doing on World War II, the kamikaze suicide pilots. But really, I think at its heart, what this book is about is books. It's about writing. It's about, what happens when the right book falls into the right reader's hands. And it's a story about a relationship between a writer and a reader. The writer is this young girl named Nao Yasutani, who is sitting at a maid cafe in Akiba, or Akihabara, in Tokyo, writing a diary. As she's writing the diary, she has a sense that there is someone out there in the world who will be her reader. She doesn't know who that reader is, but she has the faith and the confidence that there will be a reader out there, and so she addresses the reader directly. And my sense is that as she's writing the diary, the reader is growing more and more clear. It's growing clearer in her mind. For the longest time, I didn't know who the reader was either. And, as I was writing the book, several readers were in place. But eventually, the reader ended up being a novelist named Ruth, who lives on a remote island in Desolation Sound. And the diary washes up on the shore one day. Ruth finds it and, of course, assumes that it's detritus from the tsunami after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake.
And the novel is pieced together out of the interweaving of these two timelines. But it was Nao's timeline that began for you. That was the spark.
Yes, absolutely. It was Nao's voice. That was the beginning. And generally, I think that, novelists write from various places. But for me, it's usually a voice. And in this case, Nao's voice was very, very clear. She announced herself one day, and it was literally the words in the book, "Hi, my name is Nao, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is? Well, if you give me a moment, I'll tell you." And that's what I heard, and that's where the book started.
Finding a reader for her was a bit more of a struggle for you. Is there a stack of papers on your desk, as there is in your novelist Ruth, which bear witness to that search?
Yes. I mean, I actually wrote this book, I think, 4 or 5 times, with 4 or 5 different readers. So I was auditioning readers. When I first started writing it, I think in 2006, I did have this sense that the reader should be a character named Ruth, sort of an avatar for myself. But that struck me as a terrible idea at the time because it just was so self-conscious and kind of postmodern in the worst possible way. And so, I jettisoned that idea quite quickly and then substituted in I think probably about 4 other characters, each one worse than the last. And finally, beginning of 2011, I'd finished a draft and I realized I couldn't go further with it. I was in the process of submitting it when the earthquake happened. And that changed everything.
Because suddenly there was a connection.
And suddenly I realized that fictionalizing a reader was no longer an option, that I really needed to step in and address this and take it seriously. And so that's when I ended up, or I, meaning the fictionalized Ruth character, ended up back in the novel.
I mean, it's a novel. It's got 2 different narrators. It's layered into these 4 different timescales of Now's story, her account of telling her story, of Ruth, the novelist Ruth's story, and the story from the Second World War of the kamikaze pilot. I was wondering if it's constructed in such a way just because of the manner of its composition, or is it something that you were aiming at structuring that kind of rich way so that you could tell a story which is both about the, as you say, the cool drinks and tennis whites and human relationships, and also a novel at the same time about the detail in the electrochemistry?
When I'm writing a book like this, I'm struggling to find the structure. I knew that it was going to be 2 interleaved voices. I knew that it was going to be, the voice of the young girl now, and then the voice of her reader, and that the 2 characters were going to be in separate timelines, separate worlds, but that they were going to be interacting through the text. The rest of it is just the kind of flotsam and jetsam that's been, spinning around, as I said earlier, in my mind over the past decade or so, that enters the gyre of the story.
In the 21st century, do you think the novel needs this kind of shot in the arm from this kind of realism, that's something that blurs the line between fiction and fact?
In many ways, I think our notion of what's fiction and what's fact has been blurred, whether we do it intentionally or not. And I do think the internet has a lot to do with that. I mean, we all have avatars. We all are, very, aware of our online persona and the fact that we have many of them, So I think that people's tolerance for, these liminal spaces between fact and fiction, I think, is heightened.
You say that Ruth eventually arrived as being the narrator. I mean, she's not exactly the same as you, but she shares a lot of the things. She's not actually a Buddhist nun as yourself.
That's right. Well, I'm not really a Buddhist nun either. I'm an ordained priest, which is slightly different. Actually,
what's
quite
the
a bit
difference
different. Well, I mean, a nun usually lives in a nunnery, for example, and I don't. I'm happily married to my husband, whose name, in fact, is Oliver, as in the book. And I have to say too that this whole business was Oliver's idea in the first place. I mean, I was struggling in the aftermath of the earthquake and the tsunami to try to understand whether this book could even be written. And he was the one who said, you have to step in. You have to step in and be in the book as Ruth. And I said, well, yeah, that's fine. But, if I'm in the book as Ruth, that means that you have to be in the book as Oliver. And his take on that was that it was an interesting thought experiment and that we should proceed, right? These are just fictional versions of us. And we had a good time, in the same way that you tell funny stories about your past and it's fun, but you also understand that that's not quite you either, right?
A Tale for the Time Being is published in Britain by Canongate. But are these 2 culture-crossing novelists merely reflecting their own individual circumstances? Or are they part of a wider literary movement? What does it mean to uproot a writer? And how will our shifting world transform literary culture? Joining me in the studio is the novelist Evie Wyld, recently picked out by Granta as one of the best British writers under 40, and the director of English Pen, Joe Glanville. Welcome to you both. Looking at the list that Granta came up with, one of the most striking thing about that best British novelists list was how international it felt. You kind of epitomise that globe-straddling tendency in one fell swoop yourself, don't you, Evie?
I do. I'm half Australian, so I actually
grew up in the UK, which is different to what much of the bio about me says online. But my mother's Australian, so I've spent a lot of time over there.
So you were brought up over here in London, but spent a lot of time kind of travelling forwards and backwards.
Peckham to Sydney.
Yeah, and this is also true of your fiction. Your first novel was set in Australia.
It was. Yeah.
The narrator of your latest, All the Birds Singing, follows your journey across the globe.
Yeah, she does more or less. I think there's something that I find really useful about homesickness, and I sort of start to write about that for a lot of my work.
I was wondering if that list that Granta came up with, which felt so very kind of global, I was wondering if that list was just a kind of function of it being a Granta panel selecting a kind of Granta list, or whether it reflects a genuine shift in our reading, in our writing habits.
I mean, I think it shows a sort of coming together of a lot of different people to England, and I think that's really interesting. And I think it shows maybe a broadening out of what people will read. I know that working in a bookshop, India seems to be still really, really huge.
You mean people are kind of more open to things coming from the outside world?
Absolutely, yeah. Everyone's always after the next big Indian novel, as far as I can tell.
And then after India, then what next?
Then I think there's been quite a bit of Japan. I mean, I think it's a really good thing. I think it's great. And I think there's something lovely about people like Neil Mukherjee or Anjali Joseph, who are living over here, but who write about their home and where they grew up, but also about where they're living now. I think that's really interesting, the sort of outsider fiction.
Yeah, one of the things that English Pen has done for years now is work with writers who, for reasons of political will, have been forced to uproot themselves, to transfer themselves around the globe. What do you think that does to a writer, Jo?
Some writers have said to us that they find it easier to write about their own country when they're elsewhere. Whether that's a question of distance or whether it's always been the case that writers to some degree are outsiders and do sometimes want to displace themselves is one of the questions, I think. I think for writers who are forcibly in exile, it's a different question. They haven't chosen it. And I think that can be very, very tough. Writing about your country, about your culture while you're uprooted. I think one person I think of, for example, is Sema Yazbek, who's a remarkable Syrian writer and journalist and novelist, who wrote this extraordinary book about her eyewitness account, her diary of the beginning of the uprising in Syria. And that's a book that one could not have published or read in Syria. That book had to be published outside. But the writing of it was done inside because it is very much obviously rooted in the events that were taking place.
And then I guess if you've got a culture around you, people talking the street, the things that people are thinking of, then you're going to lose a connection with a sense of that if you spend time abroad.
Yes, but I think what you find if you sort of look back over the sort of past decades of literature, that some of the greatest literature about home, about a writer's home, has been written in exile. And then obviously you think of Joyce or Beckett, who wrote their greatest literature in exile. So there's something very interesting, I think, that happens to the writer when they are elsewhere, that maybe there's some kind of pain in the homesickness that Evie was talking about. Maybe there's something in that distance that enables a writer to get closer to some kind of creative truth.
Is that something that you relate to, that there's this need for distance before you begin?
Definitely, and talking to the other writers on the Granta list about that subject, there's sort of a general idea that it's harder to write about what's right in front of you. The homesickness kind of makes things a little bit brighter, a little bit more... you're able to imagine yourself into it rather than worrying about the correctness of what you're writing.
Maybe there is a kind of liberation as well, that you are outside your society, and so the constraints and conformity of that society. So maybe the freedom comes with that.
One of the things that English Pen does as well is it supports translation. I mean, one of the things that a writer, I mean, it's different, I guess, travelling from Australia to England. There may be some small differences of culture, but if you're uprooted from the language and then brought to a different country, presumably that has even broader effects.
Yes, obviously extremely difficult. And I think, as you say, English Pen promotes the translation of contemporary literature, which still, even though there may be a greater appetite for literature from elsewhere that has to be translated, that's still a struggle. And that we still only have, the absolute tip of the cream of literature from elsewhere, really, that's translated into the English language. And I think there has been a slight improvement in the volume of literature that is published in translation. There is an appetite, but it's a question always with the publisher of what's going to sell. And there are certain publishers like Granta, like Portobello, and others who have done a fantastic job recently in publishing more literature in translation, but that we still need to push for more and more.
I've noticed in the bookshop in the last sort of maybe 5 years, there's more, and it's more kind of as the foreign prize of fiction, which this year seemed particularly like a big deal and you know, and heavily promoted, and people were coming into the shop and asking for those titles, which had never happened in previous years, and there's more of a feeling that translators themselves are part of the making the art, and I think that's really interesting and expands stuff a bit more, and the better the translations are, the better the work is shown to people.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think the sort of the recognition of the translator as an artist themselves, like as a musician, as an artist, interpreting the work of someone else is a big change, and I think there's a very, very exciting culture around translators now. I think that's a big change. Translators have been the rather sort of unsung heroes of literature for so many years. I don't think people have really understood that to be a great translator is to be an artist and a writer in your own right. You've got to have the facility for language, but you've actually got to be a writer yourself. And I think for various reasons, I think partly to do with encouragement from grants, with universities such as University of East Anglia. I think there have been some really important cultural movements towards really recognising what it is that translators do. So I think it's a sort of a positive shift rather than about the sort of deficit of culture at our end.
Jo, do you think that there is now a literature which has movement, which has connection, which has global interconnectivity as its subject, rather than just as a result of the shuffling around of the practitioners?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think certainly there are novels that one can think of where you have a character whose mobility, social mobility, is possible because of opportunities that wouldn't have existed, say, 50 years ago. I'm thinking, for example, of The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And, there is a character whose life, whose globe-trotting is very much of its time. But I think that theme, in the same way that exile and displacement have always been part of literature, I think that the sort of global theme, the travel, has always been part of literature as well.
Do you see more writers putting one slice of the world against another, combining two different settings than we might want to?
I think it's the experience, if you like. I think there's sort of the difficulty in coming from one culture and negotiating another, and being a sort of person of the world today, but having to deal with the friction that comes from having more than one culture put side by side. But that can happen within one country, can't it? You don't have to go from Pakistan to Japan to experience a clash. You can have it in one city, can't you? And that was also evidence of a globalised culture as well, isn't it?
This examination of identity about whether you are truly at home in one place or another, that's another subject which is of the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, Ben Lerner's novel, Leaving the Tosha Station, it's an American man and in Spain, feeling uncomfortable with his Americanness and within his own skin, and seeing himself as this terrible American, at the same time seeing himself as very much in the Spanish life and
constructing a new Spanish
exactly,
identity.
Yeah.
And your first novel was set over there in Australia.
It was.
Your second makes the jump from over there to over here. Are you now working on something that's set in Europe, in the UK?
Weirdly, yes. I think Australia is always going to be the place that I go to first for creative stuff, but I have become more interested in the English side of my family recently, partly I think due to the death of my grandparents, which means you can delve in a bit deeper without offending anyone too much. But yeah, I think I'm going to give it a go.
Is it goodbye, Aussie farmer, the one who's done us proud? You never looked for handouts, just a chance to work it out. Wish we had stood beside you when the chips were really down. Is it goodbye, Aussie farmer? Do you pack it off to town?
Thanks to both Jo Glanville and Evie Wyld. Evie's latest book, All the Birds Singing, is published by Jonathan Cape, You can find out more about English Pen at englishpen.org. Thanks also to Michelle de Kretser and Ruth Ozeki. We'd love to hear from you with suggestions of the books which best describe our increasingly globalised world. If you're listening to us through iTunes or SoundCloud, then just search for Guardian Books Podcast and add your comments below the audio player on the Guardian website. And if you haven't already, you'll also find links there to subscribe to our weekly show. It's completely free, you'll never miss another episode. So from me, Richard Lee, and our producer, Tim Maybe, goodbye.
Global citizens who recognize we rise and fall together. Who see strength in diversity and want to create a new future together.
For more great downloads, go to guardian.co.uk/audio.